Very excited to have Kevin with us to talk about pollinator conservation in cities. But Kevin, I'll turn the mic over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Denise. And good morning, everyone. It's great to have this opportunity to share about conservation of pollinators in cities. And as Denise said, my background, I did my dissertation in the Bronx, New York, at Fordham University, where I worked on pollinators in community gardens of the Bronx and East Harlem. And then I went on and did a postdoc at University of Illinois in Chicago, um, doing some work in the Chicago region on pollinators. So I wanted to start with this image here. This is a picture of a urban neighborhood in the Bronx, New York. It's one of the spots I actually studied and looked for pollinators along this transect running along this block and also nearby neighborhoods. And you can probably imagine that this particular neighborhood block did not have that many pollinators. There's not much greenery that you can see at all. There's a shading effect, sort of a canyon effect with the buildings there. And so this would be a challenging area for pollinator conservation. But this image you can also see in the distance there. It moves into zoning for single-family residential homes, and there is some greenery next to them, a little more sunlight. We did find that there were more pollinators when it came to single-family residential as opposed to multi-family apartment buildings. But even on this block with the multi-family six-story walk-ups that you see here, there are potential for things like plantings along the terrace on the right there where the sunlight is hitting those fire escapes, rooftop gardens. Obviously, things could be planted if you could find space for adding soil along the block. And I think the thing I wanted to think about with all of you, and to start things off, is to consider what it would mean to the residents of this neighborhood and to the perception of city residents in general to see a group of monarchs migrating through this neighborhood block here, or to see some other species of pollinator or of bird or something that was moving through this area. And how would that affect people's perception of the city and of nature? So a lot of what I've been thinking about is, we think about biodiversity hotspots, and a lot of times conservation is focused on large mammals and predators and things like that. But in cities, pollinators give us an opportunity to conserve and attract things to the city that can really affect people where they live and in these very densely populated areas. So, why is this important? Many of you have probably already seen this particular figure, but it's showing decades on the x-axis there at the bottom, and population in billions on the y-axis. And you can see that around 2007, 2008, we tipped to the point of having more people living in urban settings than in rural settings. And that actually is the first time in the history of humanity that we have become more of an urbanized, urban living species on this planet. And you can also see that almost actually all of the population growth projected through 2050 is going to be in urban areas. So people are moving into cities. This trend is especially occurring at a rapid rate in places like Asia. But many parts of the world are just increasingly urbanized, and the United States obviously is, and many areas in North America are already very much urbanized in terms of where people live. So, and this is just in case the figure itself, you can just see this, and this is also a very popular image that many of you have perhaps seen before of the Earth at night with time-lapse imagery showing and highlighting really where the heavily urbanized areas of the world are currently. So if you look at just North America, the eastern United States is has really gone through that transition, the extreme west coast of North America. And then you can see other areas, obviously Europe, parts of India, parts of Asia. So you can see where urbanization is being centered on. And a lot of this is focused on coastal areas, which actually can be very important areas for biodiversity conservation because you have marine habitats, terrestrial habitats. So an area like New York City, for example, you have the Atlantic migratory flyway of different migrating birds that goes right through the New York City area and as a coastal city. So cities are often centered in coastal areas, and that often makes them especially important for conservation, but then that area also tends to be where we have lots of urbanization. So there's a few things I wanted to share before I get into the pollinators, but the importance of thinking about conservation in urban settings, and Chicago and New York City are two sort of extreme examples, but there's lots of other types of urban settings that are smaller that have similar characteristics and issues, and essentially by attracting some species, even if they are regionally common, but if you're able to attract them into a city and share with people about that species, it can provide opportunities for ecological exposure and education about those species and connect people to nature. And avoid what Dunn et al., 2006 great article that talks about the pigeon paradox, which is essentially the idea that more and more of humanity is living in cities where they're exposed to things like pigeons, and that is their connection to nature. And obviously, in many cities, people think of nature, they think of wildlife, and they think of things like rats, cockroaches, pigeons, not exactly things that typically have a favorable impression. But the paradox is that we still need to find ways to connect people to nature in cities, especially if conservation is going to be effective moving into the future. So again, just highlighting the importance of that. And I think also conservation in urban settings can really break down the dichotomous view of nature and the city as being separate entities. So this is kind of the way that most people think about nature as being apart from the city being for humans, nature being for wildlife, and there's really not much of an overlap there. But when we really work on bringing nature back to the cities where we live and where people actually spend almost all of their time, we can break that down. And you can see the enthusiasm if you've heard about pale male, the famous red-tailed hawk in Manhattan, that has caused, it's a sensation. It's amazing because it's a red-tailed hawk. This is not a rare bird, right? But it's rare in that setting. And it has this power, this allure, because it is causing people to question their notions of the city and who the city is for. So, and it's similar, there was a beaver that came down the Bronx River over the last decade or so, and there was quite a bit of press about it. And every city has these kind of examples of species coming back or species that cohabitate in the city, and people are just naturally intrigued by this. And one of the great areas we can really work on this is with pollinators. And so let me get into that. And I think that the thing I just want to highlight, though, is that suburban is very different from urban. All of them might be classified generally by the Census Bureau as generally urban, but there's lots of variation there. So the picture on the right is of New York City, and you can see the amount of impervious surface there. We're talking about 80% or higher impervious surface. That counts buildings, streets, sidewalks. But the picture on the left is more of a village or suburban kind of landscape in an agricultural matrix. So these two, even though they both have elements of urbanization, are going to be quite different for pollinators and for other species. And the other thing is to consider, what is the historical landscape for the city where you live? So, for example, Chicago, much of Chicago is built on areas that had a lot of prairie kind of habitat. There's also dunes along the Great Lakes, and there's things like that, but a lot of grassland, some forest mixed in, whereas New York City, more built on eastern deciduous forest with some marshes and other things mixed in. And clearly a place like Phoenix or some of our southwest cities are built on desert, right? So the historical landscape where the city is located is going to affect it. The degree of impervious surface and development is going to affect things. So these are all things to kind of start considering wherever you live and how that's going to affect pollinators and other species. Within cities, we also have these sometimes massive city parks, and at least, so Pelham Bay Park in the Bronx, 2,700 acres. It's this massive park, very high levels of bird diversity, plant diversity. We did not do extensive sample surveying of pollinators in this park, but I'm sure there is a wonderful diversity of bees and other things in this park. I know there have been studies of butterflies here. But just to say that the large city parks, even though they're technically within an urban area, these could be real hotspots for conservation of pollinators. And you could find some extremely rare species, even at the regional level, in some of these large city parks. So that is something I'd like to see more of, is studies and surveys of what are in these large city parks. But I'm also really interested in, and this slide just kind of brings a smile to my face, because these are community gardens, and these are much smaller than those large city parks. But this is where people really spend much of their time, is in these neighborhoods, and they might walk past a community garden, multiple times in a week. So I think even though these are smaller and maybe don't have the exact species conserving potential as the large city parks or areas outside of cities, they have a high magnitude of ecological exposure to humans' value, right? So I think that maybe we need to take that into account in our, quantifying what's of value in terms of conservation. So this is a community garden in the Bronx known as Fordham Lot Busters. And really, when I would go in and study this garden to look for bees and butterflies and things for my dissertation research, you would walk in, and the smells of this garden, the temperature would slightly decrease. You could feel, all of a sudden you would hear different sounds. There might be birds singing, or just the buzzing of insects, and really the contrast between the street, where it's much hotter in the summer, and then moving into the garden, it's very apparent, and it's very powerful for people that are involved with the gardens. So definitely something special about these spots that tend to be located in more developed neighborhoods of the city, where there are higher asthma rates, where there's less easy access to parks for people. So anyway, there's definitely a lot of positive to community gardens in these developed areas. And really, what's great about the gardens is just how people are using them, and it's not closed off to the public. They are designed to be utilized, and whether it's for agricultural purposes, for recreational, playing dominoes or playing other games. The bottom left picture there is of a peach tree that grows in Harlem, and the community gardener there, she would always hand out these peaches to people that would pass and ask for a fresh peach. So the value, again, of these gardens in terms of connecting people to nature, giving them a taste of nature in the city is just fantastic. And I became interested, this was all the way back in 2003 when I was starting my research in, kind of just what bees are in these gardens and what butterflies are coming to these highly urbanized small settings. And one of the first things we looked at was what crops are being grown, because we wanted to connect this to value for people. So we surveyed 19 gardens, and we found 25 common vegetable crops that were grown. And then we just looked to the literature to see what percentage of those common crops that are grown are dependent on insect pollination. And 92% of them benefit to some degree from insect pollination. So this really makes it apparent that bees are valuable and needed in these settings. Now, I should say in some cases there are plants like collard greens, for example, that gardeners are harvesting the leaves, and really pollinators are not required for that if they have bought the seeds from a seed packet from a store and just planted them. But if they're letting that plant go to seed and they want to collect the seeds for future use, some gardeners do that. Or if they're growing a plant that produces a fruit, such as tomatoes, husk tomatoes, or tomatillos were a common one that really benefit from bumblebee pollination, eggplant, other things like that that are fruiting bodies that you're harvesting for consumption, then of course the pollinators are critically important in those cases. So this was just sort of our first step to establishing that, bees would have, beyond just existence value and wanting to have them around, that they're actually providing a service in these gardens. So this is an aerial view of New York City, of Manhattan, and a lot of times people just think of cities and they kind of write them off as not really being a spot for conservation. But again, there really are little gems of green space, not just Central Park that you see there on the left side of the picture, but small gardens and other things that can promote some of these species. So I want to start by looking into what bees and butterflies are in urban gardens. I'm going to focus on the New York City community garden research, but I think that those results kind of apply to many, especially eastern, Midwest cities in North America. And then towards the end of the presentation, I'll get into what we can do to promote pollinator conservation in cities, some general ideas on floral resources, nesting resources, that sort of thing. So we surveyed the same 19 gardens. We looked at what vegetable crops were grown for bees, and we used a combination of bowl traps, which are these yellow bowls you see in those top two pictures. We actually had to, in some cases, suspend them from trees because the community gardens got so much foot traffic from people that if we put them on the ground, they'd get knocked over by dogs or by people. So it wasn't the standard way we would put bowl traps out and put them on the ground, but essentially you just fill these with soapy liquid, bees fly to them, and then you're able to collect them later. We also used hand nets. This picture is, we didn't actually hand net from the window of the car, although we joked that the amount of time we were stuck in traffic, maybe we should, as we moved between gardens. But most of the time, yes, we would just get out and net some bees. And I think actually this kind of brings up an interesting thing about destructive sampling. Having bee specimens is really critical to identify them to species level, because you need to get them under a scope and look at things like their wing venation to be able to identify them to that level. But at the same time, in urban settings and community gardens, there's a sense that these bees are, really relatively rare, and so there's concern sometimes. And I just read a study based out of Sydney, Australia, where community gardeners did not want the researchers to be capturing and killing and taking those specimens. So they ended up using photography and some other methods that make it a little trickier. But again, these are things that maybe we can start to do in some settings, depending on the interests of people in the area. In any case, we use these two methods. We ended up identifying about 54 species of bee in these urban community gardens of New York City, again in the Bronx and East Harlem. And I'll just show you guys some pictures of some of the common bees. So this is the common eastern bumblebee. Bombus impatiens is its scientific name. And you can see she has an enormous pollen ball there on her back leg. She's holding on with her mandibles to the sepals of an eggplant flower. And it's a still photo, so you can't tell, but she's vibrating her wing muscles to help remove pollen from the poricidal anthers of that eggplant flower. And what poricidal means is the anthers are set up in a way that they're kind of like in a salt shaker type structure. So it takes vibration from the bumblebee to release the pollen and get it to fall out onto her body. She then collects it in that pollen ball, and some of it is incidentally transferred from plant to plant. The bottom right picture just shows you a bumblebee on sunflower. You can see in that case how messy it is. It's got that pollen all over its body. It hasn't gone through the effort yet of collecting that into the pollen ball. And therefore, if it moves from flower to flower, it'll have a high likelihood of transferring that pollen. But all this is just to say that not all pollinators are equally beneficial to certain plants. And eggplant flower really will be looking for bumblebees because they have that sonicating ability. So they are efficient pollinators of eggplant. And so we need to think of pollination in cities and other landscapes as in terms of a diversity of pollinators for different flower types. This is the eastern carpenter bee. It's our largest bee in eastern North America. Xylocopa virginica is its scientific name. You can see that shiny black abdomen. And following along that theme, so these actually are quite common in many urban settings because they nest in hard lumber, so they probably benefit from human structures. We've seen nests, in city park benches. I actually was in Central Park and noticed some sawdust under a park bench, and so I looked underneath, and sure enough, there was a carpenter bee hole, and the female was excavating, and sawdust was coming out and falling on the ground. And I had heard that you can put your ear to the park bench and actually hear the female, chewing through the wood. So I put my ear to that to see if I could hear that, and I could indeed hear that, but I did get some strange looks from passerbyers, people walking by wondering what I was doing there. And also carpenter bees are, quite territorial. The males in particular will kind of buzz at your face, and it can intimidate folks a little bit. Of course, the males don't have stingers. So one of the other things I used to do with educational programming, if there were kids or even adults that were interested in bees, and you can capture a male carpenter bee, they have little sort of white facial markings that you can distinguish them from the females, and then you can hold them with your fingers and they won't be able to sting. They actually make the movement like they're stinging you. They flex their abdomen, they buzz, they try to be very intimidating, but they don't have a stinger. So it's something you can kind of share with folks. One other thing with carpenter bees is many of them are floral larcenists. They actually will bypass the pollen of the plant and bite through the base of the flower to get straight to the nectar and won't go into the flower. You can see this on things like morning glories and some other species of plant. So carpenter bees will sometimes cheat essentially the what we think of it as a mutualistic relationship of pollination, and they will just go straight for the nectar. So again, not all pollinators are created equal. They don't always do that, but in some cases they will do that. And from the plant perspective, it's not beneficial if they're not coming in contact with the pollen. So this is very common in many urban settings in North America. Are Lasioglossum. It's a genus of small sweat bee. Most people would look at these and wouldn't even consider them to be, to be bees. They would think they're flies or small wasps or something, just because they're so tiny. They're not really hairy in the way that most bees have hairs on their body. And you can really see how small it is here because this is on a lily flower, on a type of a tiger lily. But these are extremely abundant in the New York City community gardens, also in Chicago area. So again, probably in many Midwest, Northeastern cities. And even though the literature suggests that they're not the best pollinators because, again, small size, not very hairy, don't transfer that much pollen on a per visit basis, they actually, because of their abundance in cities, I think they might make up for, their per visit low efficiency based on their abundance. So I think it would be interesting to see, a study looking closely at Lasioglossum in terms of pollination and its value in urban environments, just because we do see them in a lot of urban settings. This is a longhorned bee in the genus Melisodes, and these are very fast, agile flyers. Many of them love sunflowers, so we're Asteraceae in general. They're called longhorned bees, but of course it's their antennae that are a bit longer than the typical bees. It's not that they actually have anything like a horn structure, but these are one of the more unique, I think, groups. They are hard to see because they fly so fast. I think they can be a little tricky to catch, a little tricky to identify. But if you have sunflowers and you look closely at either giant helianthus, like ornamental helianthus annuus, the large sunflower, or rudbeckia in this picture, other things like that, you will likely have some of these Melisodes around. One of my favorites here, this is a leafcutter bee in the genus Megachile, and the really distinguishing characteristic for them is the abdominal hairs that they have there, the abdominal scopa it's called. So they actually carry pollen on those hairs on the ventral surface of their abdomen, not on their legs like bumblebees and other bee species often do. So that's one way you'll notice them. If you ever see a bee with a hairy belly, and if it has, especially if it has a different color on its hairy belly, a bright color, that may be the pollen, not the actual bee, right? So that's one way to look at it. But Megachile is leafcutter bees in general, based on our research in New York City and in Chicago, again, they're pretty common in many urban settings. Pretty important pollinators as well, because these are medium-sized bees. They can transfer a lot of pollen. They are carrying it on their abdomen, which maybe increases to some degree on certain flower structures the likelihood of transfer. So a very cool group, I think. And if you see this sort of thing on plants in your garden or in your area, you likely have leafcutter bees. So these would be dime-shaped, dime-sized, maybe a little variation on that size, but pretty evenly cut cuttings that they make, that the females make. And what they do is they line their their nests with these partitions made out of these leaves, so each larva can have a different cell to develop in. So again, it's the kind of thing gardeners don't like to see this kind of damage, but it's a small price to pay in my mind for the pollination services and knowing, that you likely have these bees around. I've never seen a case where the bees actually killed the plant outright. Usually it's just some small damage on one part of the plant and the plant rebounds. But this is another favorite, Aguiclara pura, a green bee. And this, not only is it a beautiful bee, in my opinion, but it's just unique in terms of nesting in soft, rotting wood. And, why is this relevant to cities? Well, usually in many urban settings, if a tree falls, it's cut up and taken away. Often parks departments don't want to leave a fallen tree out to rot. There's issues with line of sight and for sort of police work in the parks and things like that. So that is the concern sometimes with fallen wood. But if you do have a place where you can just leave a rotting stump in a part of your garden or in whatever sort of conservation area you're looking at, there's a good chance you're going to attract these bees along with a lot of other interesting species. So this picture came from my own personal garden in the Bronx, where we just had a small rotting stump, maybe 2 feet, 2.5, 3 feet by 3 feet, and it quickly attracted a small group of these green bees. And then ground nesters like this cellophane bee in the genus Cleides. In this case, a number of females emerged from a small garden patch in the Bronx. They are called cellophane bees because they produce a substance that they line the tunnels of their underground nests to help perhaps prevent pathogen spread or keep moisture out. But they really like, in many cases, loose, bare earth. And this is something that, again, is not typically in management protocols for urban areas to leave an area of bare dirt or bare earth, right? So, but for many bee species, having that ground nesting and experimenting with different types, because some bee species will appreciate more sandy soils, some will appreciate soils with more of a slope, some need southern exposure on the nests or are more likely to pick up that kind of spot. Some like mud or muddy, silty kind of places. So if you have the opportunity and the space to try a few different soil types and configurations and then just watch what kind of holes develop there. And you can also take a clear plastic cup and put it over the hole and come back and see if there's a bee flying around in there 20 minutes later. So that's one way you can, on a sunny, warm day, so that you can kind of get an idea. But a lot of things make holes in the ground, so don't assume if you have holes that it's necessarily bees. But if you just really watch it and have some time to do some observations, you might be able to see them. So like I said, we saw all these different bees that I just showed you in these community gardens of the Bronx and East Harlem, in New York City, 54 bee species total. And that amounts to 13% of the 430 bee species that at the time we knew were in New York State. And on an individual basis, community gardens were found to have between 7 species, that was the low, to a high of 29 species. And a lot of times I would get this question of, is that good? Is that, what does that mean? Is that a lot? Is that a little? Do we need to do more? And I think a lot of this comes down to, are you a half glass full, half glass empty kind of person? In some ways, 13% of the 430 species in New York State being found in these very small gardens in heavily developed areas of New York City. I think it's pretty exciting overall, and especially considering many gardeners, people in the city have no idea about these bee species. They may be able to name, you know, two, three, four different general bee types, but they can't, they never occurred to them that there's all these different species that are cohabitating in the city with them. But there was a similar study done in suburban New York landscape in suburban gardens, and they found twice as many bee species, 110, in 21 residential suburban gardens, and 48 species. So again, if you're listening to this and you're not in a setting quite as urban as New York City, maybe you're in the suburb or a suburban mix of landscape, it is possible that your garden and your urban habitats you're working on could have up to 48 or 50 species if you put in the right plantings and really do some work on gardening for wildlife. Another big story for us with the New York City research, and then also for Chicago, and this is now appearing to be the case for some other eastern cities in North America, but just the high number of exotic bee species that we found. So out of our 54 bee species, 10 of them, 19%, were exotic to North America. And some of these bee species were deliberately brought over for pollination. Things like the European honeybee were brought over, may have been accidentally. It's unclear exactly when honeybees came over. I believe there's some different ideas on research on this, but some of these bee species essentially, hitched a ride in soil that was being transported on barges, or wood, lumber that was being transported to move other things, and they arrived in New York Harbor or other areas of North America, and then started becoming established in this new environment. What's interesting is when you compare to Black Rock Forest, which is north of New York City, by something like 50 miles or somewhere around there, north of New York City, just 4% of the species were exotic. They didn't find as many exotic species as we found in the city. So even though it's the same region, it seems like these exotic species are doing especially well in this heavily developed city environment. And really, New York City in this case, I guess it's a melting pot, not just for humans, but in this case for bees. I often get the question, are they having a negative impact? I'll get into that in the next slide. But one other thing is that California gardens, so on the West Coast, it's unclear if this trend of high numbers of exotics is really occurring. We've seen different studies found 5% of species in California gardens as exotic, so quite a bit less. So it may be that the West Coast doesn't have quite as many exotic bee species currently, at least. But all that should be studied a little bit more. All these species you're seeing in the pictures here are exotic. They're not native to North America. So do exotic bee species have a negative effect? A few studies have addressed this question. I'd love to see more research on that. One that has high potential and has been implicated as having a negative effect is the European honeybee, Apis mellifera. Because it has large colonies, it's perennial, it has many workers, it may be competing with native bee species for pollen and nectar. If you think about a hive with anywhere 40,000 individuals foraging for nectar, and that seems like it should be depleting resources for other native bee species. So that's something I think we need to keep thinking about and considering. I know a lot of people are into honeybee keeping and excited about that and all the benefits that has for connecting people with honey production, and in some cases for pollination. It might have value, but it certainly has value in large scale agriculture. But I think we need to carefully consider what potential negative effect they might be having in terms of competition. Um, Exotic bees also may spread novel pathogens. They may facilitate spread of exotic weeds. There's been some studies on that. And then on the other hand, exotic bees may provide pollination services in certain disturbed landscapes. So if you're in a New York City community garden and you have some sort of exotic megachile leafcutter bee that's very prevalent and it's pollinating your tomatoes, the question is that good? Is it okay? Because it's fulfilling that need in that setting. So all of this probably requires a bit more research and thinking about. What about the butterflies? I just want to sort of mention them because we also looked at butterflies in the city, and there's 20,000 species worldwide, just about the same number of bee species worldwide. 700 butterflies in North America, 121 that have been known to migrate through New York City. And then we found 24 species visiting community gardens in New York City. And here's some pictures of those butterflies. I have the common cabbage white, Pieris rape, as in two pictures here at the top there. Wasn't deliberate, but that's such an abundant butterfly in the city. It made up about 70 to 80% of our observations. And it's not native, it's an exotic. So this kind of follows that same trend with bees. And we also see this with birds, of cities having a lot of exotic species that do well. But we did see a lot of these other interesting butterflies, including swallowtails and other things. And tiger swallowtails, as you all know, this is a pretty common butterfly in North America. But to see it in these heavily developed spots, in this case, Jackie Robinson Community Garden in Harlem in New York, it just makes you wonder what is, again, going back to that earlier theme I mentioned, what is the value of this species, or of kids or of adults seeing this species flitting through Harlem in this case. And the other thing just to mention is if those horticulturalists that are watching this notice this plant it's on, this is Buddleia, this is butterfly bush. It's not a native, but it's an excellent plant in some settings for attracting butterflies. There is concern that Buddleia can spread into native habitats. It depends probably what vegetation zone you're living in. But just something to take into consideration if you're planting it. But in New York City community gardens, it's pretty safe to assume it's not going to spread anywhere. And is quite beneficial for butterflies. The American snout, found in a community garden in the Bronx, just a very cool looking butterfly on some daisy fleabane. And here is a great spangled fritillary, also not a very uncommon butterfly, but uncommon in this setting, to see it in New York City. So now I'm going to get into, this is a picture of Chicago, and what we can do to promote pollinator conservation just in the time we have left, focusing on floral resources and nesting resources. There was this article that just came out in 2017. It's the city as a refuge for insect pollinators. And they have this great quote here I just wanted to read, which is at the bottom here. Due to insect pollinators' relatively small functional requirements, habitat range, life cycle, and nesting behavior relative to large mammals, we argue that pollinators put high priority and high impact urban conservation within reach. So I think that's pretty much relating to a lot of what I've been trying to share here, that if you're, whatever city you're in or urban location you're working in, it may be unrealistic to conserve, make a measurable impact on larger mammals and certain species. But pollinators, you probably can, with some targeted plantings and management and monitoring on nest sites, you probably can make a big difference for those species. So first we need to know what do bees need in urban environments, and we correlated a whole bunch of things with bee richness in the New York City community gardens. We looked at total garden area, floral area, sunlight, canopy cover, All of this was within the community gardens. How old the garden was, maybe older gardens have more bees because they've had more time to be established. And then we also looked at landscape factors using GIS, so how far, how much green space and how many buildings are surrounding the community garden of interest. So this is a image of a GIS data set showing herbaceous color in the cover in the light green, canopy cover in the dark green, and then all the white is impervious surface in buildings and streets. And this is showing Central Park in Manhattan. And if there was a community garden where their star is located, we were quantifying the amount of vegetation surrounding it in these different radii, 200 meters and 500 meters, with the hypothesis that maybe those gardens that have more green space would have more bees and other species of pollinator. But essentially, we found that these three variables that are circled here at the top, total garden area, floral area, and sunlight, were by far the most predictive variables at determining urban bee richness. And this kind of led us to this, idea that essentially if you build it, they will come in urban areas, that it doesn't matter, at least in this study, in this environment that we looked at, it doesn't matter as much how much green space is surrounding it, as long as you put in a lot of flowers, as long as you can find a way to have some sunlight and make use of the garden area, you're going to get more bees than if you didn't do all those things. In terms of nesting resources, it's important to realize that 65%, we quantified all bee species found in New York City, not just those found in the community gardens, but those found in the larger city parks, those historically known, and 65% of them nest in the soil. And that's about typical percentage for, much of North America for bees, having a large number of them that nest in the soil. So again, having some spot for them to nest in the ground is important. About 24% build nests in cavities, and then some others at the bottom there, 4 that need rotting wood, 2 that need hardwood. It's the carpenter bees. 2 species in hard clay banks, so it's kind of a unique habitat there for nesting. And this is just showing what another image is of these nesting sites. So you can see an aggregation of nests in the top left in sort of more of a sandy soil kind of situation. You can see a graphic here on the right of 3 colonies of Lictus ligatus, different nest cells that have been made going down into the ground. So all this is happening wherever there is soil and space in cities for bees to make a home. And this was a video I was hoping to show, but we couldn't get to load, so maybe we'll get the link in the description for this once it's on YouTube. But essentially, this is a hydrangea shrub, and I was just looking at this cut stem of hydrangea, and a bee came out. It was a Serotina, a small carpenter bee that nests in pithy stems, cavities in pithy stems. If you have any plants that have somewhat hollow, somewhat pithy stem structures, cutting them but allowing them then to stand and not removing them all is likely going to increase your cavity nesting species. In terms of floral resources, in New York City, 80% of bees are generalist floral feeders, so they don't have a specific flower type that they're going to go to, so that they kind of are very broad in their floral feeding behavior. But 20% are specialists, and many of those specialists are relatively rare, so in some ways it's kind of exciting to think about how we can promote host plants and feeding plants for those specialist species. Asteraceae is used by a lot, and Asteraceae is very common in gardens and in cities. You see a lot of plants in that family. It's an enormous family of plants. So Melisodes agilis on the right there, on sunflower. But there's others that bee species that specialize on things like cornus, vaccinium, which is blueberry, salix, which is types of native willows, Lysimachia. So you can look at this list if you're in Eastern North America, and you can grow these things, then it could have a big impact for those species that specialize on them. And I think a lot of this comes down to not just relying on what's in the big box stores and planting the same thing as every other garden on your block, right? So we need variation to benefit not only bees, but other pollinators and other species. So trying to be creative in what you're planting and then observing what you see, and noting what you see in terms of their what they're using. We also added number of native plants to gardens to see if that could increase diversity in community gardens in New York City. We added 70 native plants to 9 gardens. We compared to unmanipulated gardens, and we controlled for existing floral area and garden size. But unfortunately, we actually did not find that these native plant additions measurably and significantly increased pollinator diversity. So part of that was that the additions were very small, and this is one of the things you'll run into in urban habitats, is that the amount of space you have to plant for wildlife is sometimes in conflict with vegetable growing or recreational use of the land. So it's not possible in all cases to add a giant meadow of plants. So you kind of have to work with what you're given, but again, that's going to limit the impact. The other thing we noticed is that while it's great to plant native plants, some exotic ornamental flowers were extremely heavily utilized by insects in the New York City setting. We also saw this in Chicago. So again, Buddleia, things like zinnias and other plants that may not be native to North America, but have a lot of nectar, a lot of pollen, and not just exotic bees are using them, native bees are using them as well. So I wouldn't advocate for ripping out all the non-natives. I think looking to see your setting, what you're trying to do in terms of native plants versus not, and then see what the bees are already using, what they're making use of, and then deciding how to move forward. So the last thing I'll share a little bit on is some ideas with urban planning and zoning and population density in cities, and then assessing urban pollination services. So we conducted a study where we took a pickup truck, drove it around Chicago and parked it, and then waited to see how long it took for pollinators to come to the flowers on that pickup truck. We called it a mobile garden. The idea was to standardize what the floral display and just look at different population densities of the city of Chicago. And what we found was kind of interesting. This graph shows the number of people per hectare in the city of Chicago, and on the y-axis is the number of bee species. And you can see that it's a significant increase. So there's more bee species in heavier developed areas of Chicago in terms of more people, more densely populated areas. And we also found, and this is likely the cause, that when there were more people per hectare in Chicago, there were more plant genera along neighborhood blocks. So there were more densely populated urban settings, a lot of duplex and tight housing units and things, but a lot of different flower types as well. And this is a synergy between humans and bees, and I think one of the few examples of where species increase with human population density. I think there's few examples of that that we ever see. A lot of the lower density areas of Chicago were dominated by turf grass, didn't have that much floral density. They were sort of smaller single family homes with a lot of turf grass, a lot of weedy species. So again, this might be somewhat unique to Chicago. And clearly once you get to a certain population density, you're going to see a decline. So the Upper East Side of Manhattan, the Chicago Loop, we didn't survey that area, but these dense skyrise areas are not going to have that many bee species just because of the shading, the amount of impervious surface. But at least at some levels, it seems that humans can be, their presence can be synergistic with the presence of bees. Okay, so again, I think I sort of mentioned this in my explanation there, but humans love flowers, bees love flowers, so there's a synergy here. Ornamental plantings may mitigate negative influences of impervious surface. So even though we have a lot of impervious surface, if the bees can nest and find nesting sites, they can move forward in terms of being present. The last study I just want to mention, we also brought plants to different yards around the city. We brought 3 different plant species: cucumber, echinacea, and eggplant. And each of these varies in terms of what kind of pollination it needs by different bee species. So the eggplant, as I mentioned before, requires buzz pollination. Echinacea is self-incompatible. Cucumber is monoecious. So these vary in terms of what, and here's the clusters of these plants that we brought to different areas of Chicago to see what bees are pollinating them. We left them for 3 days. We recorded other flowering plants, and then we measured seed and fruit set for each of these 3 species. And what we found is that purple coneflower gets visited. It's a highly attractive species of plant, gets visited by a lot of pollinators. Eggplant was visited the least. Cucumber was visited an intermediate amount. But each plant had different dominant pollinators. So cucumber had a lot of small sweat bees. Eggplant had a lot of bumblebees. And purple coneflower had a lot of different things, but Agapostemon virescens was one of the more common. Just put these pictures in here. So each of these bee species, again, I don't think most people could even name these or know about these bee species, but these are very important pollinators in urban environments that you see here on the bottom of the slide. I think we can celebrate these species a little bit more as being effective pollinators. These are all native bees, very common in urban settings. So I know we're just about out of time, but just some things you can do. We actually have a talk in about a month on beecityusa.org, efforts by cities to become more sustainable for pollinators. That's looks like a great organization. We'll hear more about that in about a month. Xerxes.org has fantastic resources and links on what bees, plants are good for your area, things like that. Citizen science programs like the Great Sunflower Project. Like I mentioned earlier, just noticing what's around you and having a notebook and going out and seeing what plants seem to be visited by pollinators. And it's okay if you don't identify them to species, just noticing, hey, this plant looks like it has a lot of different things on it. I'm going to keep this, or I'm going to, maybe even plant another one of this type of plant. Green roofs, community gardens, terraces, a lot of potential there and a lot to be studied in terms of what those can offer in cities. And being creative, trying to do things differently than your neighbors, and not just planting the same old thing. Finally, it's important for us to just keep sharing that many beneficial species exist in cities, including a diversity of wild bees and other pollinating insects. And I think if we can keep working on biodiversity in cities, it's going to be really important as more of humanity moves into being more urbanized and living in urban settings. If we can find a way to do this, I think it'll be good for conservation generally. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Denise.
All right, great. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks so much for especially those ideas at the end of what we can do on the ground. Folks, if you have questions you want to type in, we have a few minutes. We'll take a few questions. Kevin, I wonder, as you drove around to the different communities that you worked in Chicago and in New York, how receptive neighbors were to what you were doing. Was there a lot of curiosity, a lot of questions, or how'd you find the reception to your work?
Oh yeah, they people were very excited. I mean, a lot of times they would see me with my net. They thought I was out to capture rats or something like that. So there was sort of an immediate negative, like, association that um, there must be something, negative in the urban environment, to be doing this sort of ecological study as opposed to these benefits of these bee species. So usually once I started sharing that, people were excited and quite proud, especially a lot of the gardens where, I would share, hey, you've got this really cool bee species in your garden that doesn't seem to exist in many other gardens and maybe had never been recorded from that county. So yeah, people were pretty excited, and they're used to thinking of conservation as just being, on the Discovery Channel in these remote wilderness places. So I think it, got them pretty excited to see it in their backyard.
Great. Don wonders about adding artificial sandy habitat for nesting bees, if you have any input on that.
Yeah, I think there's probably some guidelines. I would think Xerces.org might have a little more. There's some things like how far down you want to dig, because um, so I don't know the exact details, but I would look to websites. I've kind of looked in the past, and I didn't find super clear guidelines. So I think a lot of it is going to be experimenting. But I would just sort of trial these things, and there might be some unforeseen consequences. You might not get bees, you might get something else, but still, it's going to be unique substrate that's not typical in the area, in many urban areas. So some species is going to benefit from it.
Okay, Jim asks if you consider honeybees to be a negative for pollination.
I think they're going to be good in terms of pollination because they're going to be highly abundant. They're going to be visiting flowers. I think the question is mostly, are they negative for other bee species? Are they competing with them to some degree? And so that's a good question. I think, and it really depends on your setting too. A lot of times I've seen some wildlife, more natural wildlife preserves who are contemplating adding honeybees because they feel like that's the right thing to do given colony collapse disorder. But in those more natural landscapes, it might be better for promoting native bees and not necessarily adding those into that particular mix. But in urban settings, I know there's a lot of like rooftop honeybee keepers in New York City, for example. Some community gardens have them. I think for pollination, they probably are benefiting as long as they're not excluding the diversity of bees that you need for pollination of different crops.
We'll take one more question. There's a question about how you feel about the role of artificial habitat like bee blocks and stem bundles to attract or conserve native bees in urban settings. And that they mentioned disease or parasite transmission as a concern, or poorly.
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Yep. I think bee blocks. So there is that with bee blocks and them being used by things like parasitoids and things you're not necessarily shooting for, although you could argue some of those might be interesting species. Um, so I think all of that is are things to kind of watch and continue to study when it comes to bee blocks. But I think in general, what I'm excited about is just creative approaches to gardens. So it's not like everyone's putting up the same nest block and